Most welcome to this seminar on the World Bank Group flagship report. We are honored to have Professor Augusto Lopez Claros with us to explain to us how this index works. And we are supported here by Entreprenörskapsforum, Johan and Pontus here, and also EVA, as you know. And EVA is an academy. We participate in public debate internationally, but of course very much in the main in Sweden. We think that these types of events and the ability to look into what's happening in the world around us is actually just down the road of where and what we want to be in terms of being a platform for that public insight. There are many indexes around the world, many indices around the world, and they are usually also ranking, and we will hear more about this one before. To me, I think that's actually very good. First of all, it gives us an understanding of how our country, these are country indexes right now, is doing compared to other countries. And from that, you can see, obviously, how competitive are we as a nation, and that's compared to other nations, but of course it's also very interesting to see how can our young generation of potential entrepreneurs, how can they actually relate to the systems that we have in Sweden, and what would have happened had we learned from other countries. I think one of the absolute best effects of these types of indices is that you can go around to other countries and find out what they have done that seems to be much, much more successful. I was telling a couple of people around the breakfast table here this morning that I was in France with a very similar discussion on how they could become more innovative and more entrepreneurial. And after a while, this was between the Nordic countries and France, and after a while we said, you know, take the Swedish tax system, take the Danish labor market system, the Finnish basic schools, and then keep everything as French. And that probably would have been not a so bad recipe for doing something different in France. I think this is one of the best things that we can be. I'm happy to see, I think, that Sweden is doing reasonably well. I think we need to understand that we should remember that that's not always been the case. On the entrepreneurial side, we had a period between, let me make it easy, say 25 years, 68 to 93, compared to the 25-year period after 93. 68 to 93, we had very low entrepreneurial startup rates. And we had a number of large Swedish companies. I need only to remind you of IKEA and Tetra Pak, who left the country because of the political debate that we had during the 68. And I can certainly feel sorrow for those companies having left the country, but I can feel even more sorrow and real pain over the fact that we had, over that period of time, 68 to 93, a great number of companies that were never started, just because the politics around what we were doing were such that we were not enhancing how to be an entrepreneurial nation and how to get young people to start. Nowadays, I think we probably are different there. I think we have a young generation of entrepreneurs, and we would now like to hear how Sweden compares to other countries when it comes to setting this up. So with that, let me hand over to Pontus.
Thank you very much, Leif. My name is Pontus Braunhielm. I'm a professor in economics at KTH and also research director at the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, Entreprenörskapsforum, and also at the board there. So, again, a warm welcome to this jointly organized session between Entreprenörskapsforum and EVA. I think you all know EVA pretty well, but Entreprenörskapsforum may be an animal that you're not so familiar with. So let me just take 1 minute to explain what we're doing. So we conduct and communicate research on entrepreneurship and innovation and what that means for a country's or a region's development. It means that issues addressed may concern globalization, technological breakthroughs, migration, the institutional setup more generally. It's a wide area of topic that we address in our research. But the thing is that there must be a connection to entrepreneurship, or for that matter, intrapreneurship and innovation. Another key concept is policy relevance. And that is, of course, something that is very closely connected to today's topic, namely the Doing Business Index. Ease of doing business, the business climate or entrepreneurship climate is of very high relevance for us. And that's why we find it so interesting and so useful with this particular index. And we have a very constructive and cooperative relationship with Professor Lopez Carlos' group at the World Bank. I'm very happy to say that. And with those words, this very short explanation of what Entreprenörskapsforum is doing, let me hand over to today's moderator, that is Björn Nilsson. And Björn is also the managing director of IVA. So please, Björn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Pontus. So I'm Björn Nilsson, and I have the pleasure of being the president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. I will also have the pleasure to moderate this session, and also the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Our speaker is, of course, very hard to introduce because the CV would take an extensive time to explain, because it's very, very extensive. And of course, Professor Augusto Lopez Claros is a very well-known person in this field. He is the Director of Global Indicator and Analysis of the World Bank Group since 2011, if I'm correctly informed. Earlier in his career, he spent also time as a chief economist and director of the World Economic Forum, of the Global Competitiveness program. And of course, for many years, he was the editor of the well-known Forum's Global Competitiveness report, also a cornerstone in this field of describing how countries compete. He has a degree, not too surprisingly, in mathematics, and also his PhD is in economics. The mathematics is from Cambridge University and the economics from Duke University. He has spent time at Lehman Brothers, also at the International Monetary Fund, where he also served for some years in the Russian Federation. He was a professor of economics at the University of Chile, and Professor Lopez has lectured and he has written extensively in a wide range of topics in his career. He's a very much sought after international speaker. He comes straight from Davos, and I've also learned from his colleagues that mainly he sends his staff to present this index, but in a few occasions he shows up himself, like in Davos, at the OECD, and of course here in Sweden at Entrepreneurship Forum and IVA. So please welcome, give a hand to Professor Augusto Lopez Claros. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you this morning. What I'd like to do is a couple of things. I'd like to tell you what we do in the Doing Business project, which has been going on at the World Bank for 14 years. And also I'd like to give you a sense of the kind of impact that the report is having in the world at large. Doing Business is actually more than just a report. Behind it, there is a huge database, and behind the database, there is an enormous amount of advisory work that the World Bank is doing that involves literally hundreds of people, professionals within the World Bank, engaging with dozens and dozens of countries all over the world. So it's a huge operation. It wasn't perhaps envisaged as such. It was, I think, initially conceived as an academic exercise, but it has evolved over time, and it has really become a very, very large animal, within the work that the World Bank is doing. Essentially, what we do in the Doing Business report is we have built up over the years a number of indicators that capture different dimensions of the business environment. And the indicators themselves have actually been developed on the basis of insights from the economic literature and from the empirical work that the World Bank has been engaged in for many years. Just to give you 2 or 3 examples very quickly. For instance, we have known for quite a long time, even before the Doing Business project, that countries where it is more difficult to set up a company, where there are procedural complications and bureaucracy associated with the setting up of a company, we know that in those countries, levels of informality tend to be higher and levels of corruption tend to be higher. And perhaps this does not come as a surprise, because you know, if it is very difficult to do things legally because of bureaucracy and because of other administrative obstacles, then you would not be surprised that entrepreneurs are going to find other ways to get around the regulation, and bribery and corruption is one of them. And of course, informality likewise. You would expect informality to be larger in those countries where the sort of the legal framework is less clear, and where it is more difficult to be formal and to be within the framework of the law. We have also known that in those countries where it is difficult to export at the border because of procedural complexities and bureaucracy, the volume of exports tends to be lower. Economists have actually calculated elasticities, which suggest that, for instance, for every extra day that it takes to clear the border, the volume of exports drops by slightly more than 1%. And if we're talking about agricultural exports, the figure is more like 4%. Elasticity is much higher. We have known that if property rights are insecure, it is much more difficult for the entrepreneur to use his property as collateral to access the financial system, and therefore the level of financial intermediation and credit will be lower than would be the case in an environment in which property rights are very clearly defined and secure, and so on. So at some point in the early part of the previous decade, we at the bank decided that, well, why don't we bring some of these insights together, and we put together a group of indicators that will, in a sense, aggregate these insights and eventually come up with a single measure that will capture, in some sense, you know, the quality of the business environment as faced by the business community. And so that's the story behind the indicators. We have 11 indicators altogether. We're developing a 12th, which I will refer to in a couple of minutes. And I mentioned 3 already: starting a business, trading across borders, registering property, but we have others. We have one on enforcing contracts, we have one on construction permitting, we have one on paying taxes. Paying taxes is very important. You would think that countries would make it easy for entrepreneurs to pay taxes. It's the opposite is true. It is complicated. It takes time. It is very often in the context of a great deal of lack of clarity about the tax regulation. And so we have an indicator called paying taxes, which captures the time that it takes to settle your tax obligations, the number of payments that you have to make, and also the tax rate, which, as you will see soon, you know, varies dramatically from country to country, and so on. So this is a little bit the background of this project. Now, what we have tried to do over the years is to innovate. We didn't have 11 indicators to begin with on year 1. We had 5 actually, and you know, we have built up the indicators over time, capturing you know, different dimensions of the business environment as we have grown. But also because we live in a kind of a changing global environment, because the global economy is increasingly complex, we have had to adapt to these changes. To give you an example of the kind of changes that we have made, I will go back to something that we did last year. We have an indicator called registering property, which captures the time, the number of procedures, and the cost associated with registering property when, you know, it changes hands from the seller to the buyer. And this indicator did us well for many years. But then we began to get a little bit of criticism from some of the countries France, for instance, did not do very well in registering property, and they came to us at the World Bank, and they would sit down with myself and my team, and they would make the following argument. They would say, look, your indicator is very much focused on the procedural efficiency of registering property. And we admit that in France, it takes time to register property, and it's actually quite expensive. But, they would say, once the property is registered, the security of the transaction is very great. We hardly ever have litigation through the judicial system because there is lack of clarity in our regulation. And your indicator, as you have defined it, doesn't bring in this particular dimension of our system, which we think is its strength, right? And so sometimes jokingly they would say, what you're doing at the bank is with your focus on procedural efficiency, you will ultimately develop an indicator where shaking of hands will be sufficient. That's one procedure, it takes 1 minute, and it doesn't cost anything. And so that will be your country that will be the leading the indicator on registering property. Of course, I think that they meant that only half seriously, but they were making a more general point. And so what we did is, we took this criticism on board, and last year, in addition to these three components which capture the procedural efficiency, we developed a separate index, which we integrated with these three components, that brings in 30 different dimensions of the quality of the land management system, and that ultimately says something about the strength of property rights in the country. And so our registering property indicator now is much stronger. It brings in all these dimensions. The French do much better in this more comprehensive index, although that was not the purpose of why we did it. We didn't do it to help the French. We did it because we thought that there was some value to the criticism. And like this, we have done other innovations. So this year, the 2017 report, which was issued a couple of months ago, is also a year of some innovation. And there is one particular innovation that I'm very proud of, which I will now explain. In my department, there is doing business is one of the big things that we do, but it's not the only one. We have a number of other projects, many of them of a benchmarking nature. And one of them, which is a jewel of a project, is called Women, Business and the Law, where what we do for a large number of countries, 173 until the last report, and now we're going to be doing it for 190. We look at the civil code, we look at the family law, we look at the constitution, we look at all the legal instruments that typically exist in a country that have some kind of bearing on economic activity, and we identify the ways in which governments are using the law to restrict women in some way, to undermine her property rights, to limit her access to the job market, to the labor market, that make it sometimes necessary for her to obtain the authorization of her husband to open up a bank account, to get a national identity card, to open up a business, and so on. We have developed a large number of indicators, and in the end, what we can tell you, and this is the value of this project, is that, to give you an example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, there are 27 restrictions that we have been able to identify in the law that in some way discriminate against women, that may make difficult for her, and sort of make it more difficult for her to become an entrepreneur and to join the economy. And so, from this report, which has led a kind of a separate life within the World Bank, we learned many years ago that, for instance, in some countries, if you're a woman, it's actually more difficult to get a business started. There are more procedures to fulfill. There are authorizations that you have to get, for instance, from your husband, that are not relevant if you happen to be a male entrepreneur. And so people began to tell us, hey, some of your doing business indicators are biased. You are not correcting for the fact that in some of these countries, half of the population is actually facing a more difficult business environment. And this was a very valid criticism. And it was something that was particularly painful to me as the director of this program. I care a great deal about the credibility of the indicators. And so We didn't do this innovation until this year because we didn't have the data for 190 countries, which is the coverage of doing business. And so with the support of some donors, I should say the generous support of some donors, because data collection for a large number of countries is very expensive, we finally concluded that data collection effort a year ago. And this year, what we have done is in 3 of the doing business indicators, we have made this correction. So that if in a country today, it is more difficult to set up a company because you happen to be a woman because you have to fulfill more procedures, it's more costly to you, and so on and so forth, then we penalize the country. We make an adjustment to the data. And so this year, doing business has this sort of gender dimension included, and for that reason, I think it is a much stronger report. There are 38 countries that get affected by this adjustments to the data. As you can see, most of these countries are in the Middle East and North Africa region, and many of them are in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are 3 in South America: Ecuador, Suriname, and Chile. And we may do a bit more of this in the future. So far, we have limited our adjustments to 3 indicators: starting a business, registering property, and enforcing contracts. We had to be a bit cautious in terms of how energetically we moved on this front. As you can imagine, there are countries in the World Bank constituency that are not great fans of women, business, and the law, because we identify these restrictions, we publish them. It's a database that is publicly available, and sometimes this creates a bit of discomfort. I'll be happy to say more on this, but for now, let me just pass on and continue. I said that we're developing a 12th indicator. This is an ongoing project. It is going to be an indicator on public procurement. You know, public procurement is a very, very important economic activity. Countries typically spend anywhere between 10, 15, 20, 25% of GDP selling to the government. We are thinking of calling this indicator precisely that, selling to the government. And what we have done is for about 180 countries, so we're still 10 short of collecting the data, we have brought in a large number of dimensions of the public procurement process. You know, the transparency, you know, whether the information is available online, what sort of security deposits are required at the time that you make the bid, and so on. I won't go into the details. It's a very complex operation. We have collected a huge amount of data. And in fact, the data has been so valuable and so interesting that even before we integrate this indicator into the Doing Business project, we have already published a couple of reports on public procurement with the data that we collected. And we're going to use a subset of that data to design an indicator in coming months. And the idea is to include this indicator in next year's, to the 2019 report, which would come out this October. In the spirit of innovations, one of the things that we have done in recent years, which I just want to spend a couple of minutes on, is, you know, Doing Business has acquired a very huge media presence. It is really the most sought after and the most iconic report put out by the World Bank. Let me assure you, I'm not in competition with my other very distinguished fellow directors at the World Bank, some of whom work on the World Development Report, but the data just shows that the Doing Business report, you know, 500,000 copies get downloaded every year. Therefore, its reach is really, really vast. And as I have said before, it has spawned a huge amount of work and operations within the World Bank associated with the data. You know, I have literally hundreds of colleagues giving advice to governments and to countries on how to, for instance, amend their bankruptcy law. Because countries are coming to the World Bank and saying, I'm not doing so well on the resolving insolvency indicator, and it appears to be because my bankruptcy law is old, it hasn't been amended in the last 30 years, so please can you help us, you know, come up with a more modern, more relevant, more helpful bankruptcy legislation, and therefore there will be lawyers within the World Bank who do not work in my department. They work in the advisory side of the World Bank, and they will go and help the country draft a new piece of legislation. One of the challenges one of the reasons why the World Bank, I think, the Doing Business report has acquired this prominence is linked to the rankings, which are a bit controversial. I won't shy away from saying that, but they have also galvanized public attention and have really led governments to very much focus on their data and on their performance, because the rankings, of course, immediately allow for comparisons across international borders. Now, one of the problems that we had with the rankings is that they are relative in nature. The problem with rankings, from a purely methodological point of view, is that a country can make progress with respect to its own history and can still fall in the rankings because other countries are making more progress, right? That's the nature of the sort of relativity of rankings. And so I would often encounter, and some of my other colleagues in my department, I'm not the only person that makes public presentations on doing business. I have a very talented team. And as we travel around the world, very often the complaint would come from authorities. Look, I've done a number of things last year. The person speaking typically was, say, the economy minister or some other senior official. And when the report came out a few months ago, lo and behold, notwithstanding the good things that we have done, we dropped in the rankings, whatever, 5 places. And then the prime minister has summoned me and has told me, well, what's going on? You have been telling me that you're doing all these wonderful things, and look what the World Bank is saying, that instead of being 120, now we're 125. And there was some frustration because very often these were allies. These were people within the government that were very much aligned to the kinds of ideas that we're promoting at the World Bank. So what we did, partly in response to this situation, is we developed a new metric, an absolute metric of progress. And we call this the distance to the frontier. And now we're using distance to the frontier scores to generate the rankings for doing business. So a couple of years ago, we sort of made a change in the methodology of our rankings calculation. And the distance to the frontier metric is actually based on a kind of interesting idea. We developed this idea with some of our researcher colleagues in the research group of the World Bank. As I said, this is a big operation, and we collaborate shamelessly with very talented economists and other researchers in the World Bank. And essentially, what we did is we looked at the entire data set at that time for something like 11 years, for all the countries, all the sub-indicators, of which there are nearly 40. And we said, where are the best practices in the world? So to give you an example, we have an indicator called starting a business. We capture the time, the procedures, the cost associated with setting up a limited liability company. And it turns out that if you ask yourself, where is it quickest to get a business started? The answer to this question is New Zealand. It takes half a day. They have developed a very efficient system. It's all an online platform. And the New Zealanders have basically, just developed a very, very efficient platform that allows a potential entrepreneur to set up a company in half a day. And so for us, for the sub-indicator time to set up a business, the frontier is New Zealand. In other words, no country does it better than New Zealand in that particular area. Where is it fastest to enforce a contract? Well, there are some countries where if you, as the business head, have a problem with a supplier who hasn't delivered the goods, and you need to enforce the contract because you have given him a prepayment, and you need to enforce the contract through the judicial system, it may take 3 to 4 years, which basically means it's very costly. You're going to spend a lot of time in fees and in court costs and so on. And in the end, you may actually opt for just letting the money go, because you're going to spend more money trying to recover it than one you actually spent already, right? Well, in Singapore, it takes 120 days to enforce a contract. Very quick, very efficient. The Singaporeans have developed all kinds of electronic systems, for litigation and for interacting with the court system. And so for us, that is the frontier. for the sub-indicator time that it takes to enforce a contract. I think you begin to get the idea, right? Slovenia, it costs nothing to set up a company. They have developed a system whereby if you're an entrepreneur, you don't have to pay anything. In Spain, it costs a couple of €1,000. And so we have, the whole variety of experiences across the world. And so the frontier is a kind of a line that we define at 100, which is kind of a horizontal line that goes from left to right in this graph. And once you have defined the frontier, what you can do is you can ask yourself, let's say, go back to 2010, and you can ask yourself, in 2010, where was my country in relation to the frontier? And those are the little yellow dots that go from left to right. And then you can ask the question, in last year's report, where was my country in relation to the frontier? In other words, how much did it narrow the distance to the frontier over the last 7 years? And those are the spikes, the blue spikes. And so the bigger the spike, the more you have narrowed the distance to the frontier. The nice thing about this metric is that then a country can drop in the relative rankings, but can still improve its score in the distance to the frontier metric. And so I would go back to that minister that complained to me a few years ago and would say, look, what you tell your prime minister is, yes, look, we dropped a few places in the ranking because rankings are relative, but our distance to the frontier score has improved a couple of percentage points, which means that our business environment this year is better than it was last year. And this is important. It is important to be able to compare yourself with respect to your own history. We may not be able to do anything about the fact that New Zealand and Singapore are the top performers and that we are still behind them in many ways, but at least we can do something about how we're doing with respect to our own history. And so now the use of the relative rankings together with the distance to frontier scores has led to a much greater degree of comfort and acceptance on the part of our stakeholders, the authorities and the governments, and I think it has improved the quality of the dialogue and also the political sustainability of this project, which at times has been under pressure from some corners. These are the results. These are the top 50 ranked countries in the last Doing Business report. As you can see, Sweden is in a very respectable place, 9th in the world, so it's a top 10 performer. You can see the distance to the frontier scores on the right-hand side. So New Zealand, which has overtaken Singapore as the number 1, has a distance to the frontier score of 87.01. And Sweden is just a few points behind at 82.13. The upward-looking arrow that you see are those countries for which, in the last cycle, the distance to the frontier score improved. And as you can see, it improved for many countries. And that's the the encouraging bit that I referred to. This shows you the share of countries in each region of the world that is engaged in doing business reforms. So, for instance, in Sub-Saharan Africa, 75% of the countries are implementing doing business reforms. At least one, sometimes many more, 3, 4, 5. It's not unusual. For us, this is very, very encouraging. The Doing Business report has really become a very, very important tool in the dialogue that the World Bank has with Africa. This number, 75%, 10 years ago was 35%. In other words, the presence of the Doing Business report in Africa has increased dramatically. And it has led to a huge amount of engagement between the bank and African countries. And for us, this is very important because Africa remains the region of the world that has some of the largest, most important clients as far as the bank is concerned, in terms of what's at stake as regards the development process. This is a chart that shows the cumulative improvement in the distance to the frontier scores over the last many years by region of the world. And you can see on the left-hand side that the region of the world that has made the largest improvement is Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. This is the region that in the World Bank we call ECA. That basically includes Poland and the Baltic countries and the Czech Republic and Slovenia and also a few countries in Central Asia like Kazakhstan and some of the other Central Asian republics. And it's notable to see how this region has really improved much faster than many of the other regions. On the extreme right-hand side, you have the OECD, which has shown the least improvement, which is not surprising because the OECD was already doing well when doing business was launched. So there has been improvement, but less than in places like Africa and the Central and Eastern Europe. You might ask, what is it about Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia that has led to this fairly dramatic improvement? Why are some of the countries that have made the most progress in this region of the world? And here, we've looked at the data, and there appear to be at least a couple of things underway. One of them has to do with the fact that many of these countries, already since the early 90s, have been on a kind of a reform momentum. They have been engaged in institutional and economic reforms in the early stages because they needed to qualify for entry into the European Union. This would have been until 2004 when they joined, and that was the incentive. I remember traveling throughout the 1990s through the region and was really quite impressed, with the energy and the, very broad consensus across the political spectrum that yes, we need to do reforms, we need to amend our legislation, because at the end of this process there will be a very important reward, which is entry into the European Union. And then, of course, since 2004, once they join in, they have continued with these reforms because now Poland and the Czech Republic and Latvia and Estonia and so on, they have to compete with Sweden and they have to compete with Germany. And so the incentives have shifted, but the reform momentum remains there. And so it is very often the case that when we look at, the 10 countries that improved the most in the last year in terms of the distance to the frontier score, many of these countries happen to be located in this region. And this is my way of complementing the European Union. The European Union has had a bit of a rough time in the last couple of years because of the euro crisis and so on and so forth. But we tend to forget that actually it's a very, very effective convergence mechanism. Some of the countries with the lowest Gini coefficients in the world are located in the European Union, and there has been a great deal of convergence between the poorer members, to the levels of income per capita of the richer members over the last, 15, 20 years. Just a couple of bits. If you go back to 2005 and ask yourself, in how many countries in the world did it take less than 20 days to get a business started? It turns out that the number was 41. Today it is 130. There has been a dramatic increase in the ease of doing business, at least as regards this indicator is concerned. But in fact, it's not just this ease to start a business. Here I have many charts which show you. I won't go into too much of this description here, but if you look at the upper left-hand graph. What we did is we split the sample into two groups. One we call the worst quartile. These are the countries where it's toughest to do business in the world, where it's complex, it's procedurally difficult, it's very costly. You have to be a hero to want to become an entrepreneur in these countries because the government is so obstructionist. Venezuela is in this group, for instance. And then the best three quartiles. And you can see that if you go back to 2005 and you ask yourself, how many days does it get to get a business started in the worst quartile? It takes 117 days. Although in places like Venezuela, it takes a couple of hundred days. And then how many days does it take to get a business started in the best three quartiles? It takes 29 days. So there's a gap of 88 days between the two countries, between the two sets. But by 2016, this gap has been narrowed to 29 days. Huge progress. There is a sort of a convergence underway in the data, and this is very encouraging for us at the bank because we are an organization that is very much committed to the idea of convergence. We would ultimately like countries in Africa to have the standard of living and the opportunities that your young people in Sweden have. It will take long. It's a huge challenge. Africa remains the region of the world where it is still most difficult to do business, but it is nice to see that there is a process of catching up. I'm looking at my watch. sometimes people ask, why is it that you don't have an indicator for corruption? And the answer to this question is that there is a huge correlation between the corruption perceptions index of Transparency International on the one hand and the distance to the frontier scores of doing business on the other. As you can see, the correlation coefficient is 0.8. So the ease of doing business score, or the distance to the frontier score, is a very nice proxy actually for levels of corruption. And this makes eminent sense in those countries where there are a lot of procedural difficulties. Businesses will try to get out, will try to bypass the existing regulation, not to comply with it, and they will do that by paying bribes. Of course, the other interpretation is also likely that very often these bureaucratic complexities and procedural difficulties are deliberately introduced by public officials in order to extract bribes from the business community, right? So they're there as part of the sort of a culture of bribery in some of these countries. This year, you may have noticed that the subtitle of the report is Equal Opportunity for All. We have looked at the whole question of inequality, also partly because we included this gender dimension in some of the doing business indicators, which has a great deal to do with equity in society, providing opportunity for women. And I don't have time to go into a kind of a detailed overview of what has been happening to inequality in the world. Let me skip and show you one little interesting exercise that we did at the bank, by simply to highlight that we have a very serious problem in inequality in the world today. A couple of years ago, one of my former colleagues at the IMF wrote a piece in the Financial Times called, if I remember correctly, The Golden Age of Growth. And his argument essentially, I don't want to trivialize, it was a very good article, but the argument can be captured in a couple of sentences. It was basically saying, look at the data. For the last 20 years, the low-income countries have been growing at twice the rate of the high-income countries. Therefore, they're catching up. Therefore, we have entered into the golden age of growth. Eventually, there will be convergence. Let's celebrate. That was the essence of the piece. Now, the data on which this argument is based is actually correct. The low-income countries have been growing more quickly than the high-income countries already for quite some time. The question really is, how long will it take for this convergence to take place, right? And once you begin to look at the data, the results are really quite interesting. It turns out that if you look at the average income per capita of the low-income countries, it's about $600 per year. The average income per capita of the high-income countries is about $41,000 per year, right? So if you take a look at these two sets of countries and you say, okay, I'm going to allow the low-income countries to grow, let's say, at 4% on average for the foreseeable future, which is just an extrapolation of what has happened in the last 20 years, and you say, I'm going to allow the high-income countries to grow at 1.8% per year for the foreseeable future, which is, again, the rate that we have actually registered over the last 20 years, then you can ask yourself, well, when do they converge? Because, of course, it is arithmetically true that convergence will take place if one set of countries is growing at twice the pace of the others. That will happen. But the question is when, right? Well, it turns out because you're applying a 4% rate to $600 and you're applying 1.8% to $41,000, the gap actually widens for many, many, many more years, because 1.8% to 41,000 is a number that is a lot bigger than 4% of 600. I'm simplifying the argument a bit, but I think you get the general sense. Well, it turns out that the gap widens until about well into the next century, until it becomes $404,000. And then the year of convergence in that first scenario is 2210, okay, a full couple of hundred years from now. And this is not very encouraging, right? It's not very encouraging to tell you're the head of state in an African country, and you tell your people, don't migrate to Western Europe, stay here. We're improving our doing business indicators, and you hang around for a couple of hundred years, and we will have the opportunities that we have in Sweden and in Germany and so on, right? So what we've discovered is that there is a kind of an interesting correlation between distance to the frontier scores on the one hand and Gini coefficients on the other. Basically, by improving the quality of the business environment, you are providing opportunities to the business community. You are making it easier for small and medium-sized companies to make a contribution to the economy. You are allowing, young entrepreneurs and women and other groups of people to basically boost their income. And this tends to improve income distribution, which is encouraging. It's encouraging for us that doing business and the doing business project and improving in the doing business indicators is having this collateral effect. Actually, in the women business and the law data, we have also discovered that correlation. Countries that have better that have let me be careful to be accurate. Countries that introduce policies that make it much easier for women to integrate into the labor market are countries that tend to have much lower Gini coefficients as well. So it's kind of nice that at least these two main projects in the bank have this implication for income distribution. Let me conclude by just quickly showing you some interesting data for Sweden. This is not the top 50, but a whole range of different countries across the world. Again, Sweden is number 9, but you can see other countries. You can see China at 78. You can see Turkey 69. Turkey, by the way, has dropped quite a bit this year, not surprisingly, given what is happening in the country. Venezuela is well on its way to being the last country in the world. It has been dropping consistently over the last few years for reasons which are nicely captured by the data. And in Venezuela, during the last year, the public sector was working only 2 days per week because they couldn't keep the lights on for the rest of the week. And so that actually led to a delay in many of the procedures, because you want to get a stamp or you want to fulfill a procedure, you go to the government office and you see the sign, it's closed, come back on Monday, right? And today is Wednesday, and so it takes longer to do everything. Venezuela is a very sad case, actually. I won't go into details. As you can imagine, I come from Latin America, and I'm not indifferent to what's happening in that country, which is rapidly becoming a basket case. This is the Swedish data, the top 3 indicators, the bottom 3 indicators. Sweden does well, which is not to say that it couldn't do better, but it does well. It does particularly well in trading across borders because it is a member of the European Union, which is a free trade area. It does well on getting electricity, on starting a business. And the areas where it does less well, and by the way, all the countries have, top performers and areas for improvement, are enforcing contracts, protecting minority investors, and getting credit. Okay, I'm told I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be very happy to hear what my panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting lecture here. Now we will do the following. I have some follow-up question for you. Then we will have a very, very distinguished and I would say highly opinionated panel to join up here. And then before we end, at the latest 9:30, I promised, we will also have some opportunity for questions from the audience. First, let me ask you some questions from me. This is an extremely interesting report that I have personally used a lot in recent years, in particular a year ago, where I have a question actually on my experience on using that externally. But how do you finance this? This looks like a very commendable and extensive work, and often, and there are many policymakers in this room, often we are dreaming about data like this, and then we think, what would it cost? Even nationally, it costs a fortune to gather data together, and you need to quality assure them. I think this is a very trustworthy report. So, do you have enough financial resources to do everything you need, and how do you finance it?
Okay. The core part of doing business is actually funded by the bank itself. the bank has decided many years ago that this is going to be part of its mainstay of activities, and therefore I get a budget allocation every year to fund much of the work. Now, this project could not be implemented, and this kind of level of data collection could not be carried out if it wasn't for the fact that we have developed over the years a network of 12,000 professionals all over the world who work on a pro bono basis for the bank as part of the data collection effort. Right? See, the data is a blend of two types of data. It's a reading of the law, and in the doing business team I have many lawyers who are experts at reading the tax code, reading commercial law, and so on. And then we have these contributors on the ground that we have engaged with over the last many years, and they help us, enhance our understanding of what's happening on the ground. If I want to know how many hours per year does it take to prepare, to file, and to pay your taxes in Mexico City, I have 10 or 11 or 15 contributors in Mexico City that actually will tell me, because they are engaged on a daily basis with companies, helping them, fulfill their tax obligations. And so, if I had to attach a market value to the time spent by these 12,000 people every year, delivering, very important data to us, then this project would be very expensive indeed. All right. It would be far more expensive than the money that I get from the World Bank to pay the salaries of my staff, to finance travel and other variable costs. So it's basically a combination of these two things.
So thank you very much. So you find, even though we don't have slavery anymore, you found a model where you can get volunteer work.
Right.
I will not ask all the questions I have, because I think the panel also deserves it. One thing that I get very curious about, because in this country we talk very much about labor market regulations. It's part of, I would say, our history and our background to really have a controlled labor market. You, in the report, you report that you have collected data that you don't yet use. Can you comment a little bit how you like to move forward on that?
I told you that we have 11 indicators, one of which is deals with labor legislation. But this data is actually not integrated into the Ease of Doing Business ranking. The Ease of Doing Business ranking is based on only 10 indicators. And there is a kind of a painful history behind this. What was then called the Employing Workers Indicator, which captured the labor market legislation, was part of the Ease of Doing Business project until about 2009, 2010. And then it was taken out under some pressure from the labor unions and other stakeholders, because there was a perception that the index did not strike a right balance between the benefits of labor market flexibility, which is what matters to the business community, and, at least as argued by the trade unions, the benefits of social protection and other kinds of protections. And there was a large argument and so on, and then it became very political, and I don't want to go into the details of this history, but basically the World Bank decided that it would take out this data from the index. It would publish the data on an annual basis, which we have continued to do. And the idea is that at some point, once we have developed an indicator that could withstand this criticism, we will put it back into the index. It hasn't happened so far, but there is a project underway, and we're continue to do research in this area.
Yeah. So I guess that the more important this index has become, the more criticism you will receive. Final question for me. A year ago, me and Pontus, we were helping organizing a big event in Africa, in South Africa, dealing with how can innovation promote the development of Africa in general. In my introduction, I used Doing Business Index as part of explaining what's happening and last year's report. You had Botswana was one of actually of the best improvers. So that was pointed out specifically in one chapter, and I referred to some changes in Africa, to cut a long story short. I didn't know that a minister from Botswana was sitting in the front row. He didn't say anything during that session, but he came up later and said, do you know, we have a full office in my ministry only dealing with these indices. So therefore, because we think it's so important. Can you comment a little bit how actively actually countries are using this index? Is it becoming a religion almost? Because for him it was. If we improve here, because the correlation on macroeconomical parameters, which you didn't comment in your speech, but it's in the report, it's pretty good. I think it's better than anything else. So if you want to improve, become better, grow your GDP, whatever you like to do, lower your unemployment or something, you should secure. This is a more sanity factor, as he explained it. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Actually, Botswana would not be one. Actually, it would be one among many such countries where, in fact, high level commissions have been set up, sometimes under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister, or very often led by a senior member of the government, and where basically there's a great deal of focus on the doing business indicators and tracking the data, engaging with my team. We have that. As part of the data collection process, we give countries an opportunity to challenge the data. It's part of being open and, part of being also a little bit humble in terms of our ability to collect a reliable, accurate data we gain from getting government criticism. Well, this is a huge operation. Every year, we have engagement with more than 100 governments on the doing business data. And by this, I mean exchanges of correspondence numbering sometimes 50, 60, 70 pages between my team and officials on the other end, or video conference calls, or visits by my team to the capital to discuss the data. And more governments are actually putting the doing business indicators at the center of government policy. Look at what has happened in India in the last couple of years. Prime Minister Modi has said basically, it's interesting. Indian public officials used to be sharp critics of doing business, and very often they would dismiss the results. Then Prime Minister Modi assumes power, and he says, hey guys, we are deluding ourselves if we are actually going to be arguing that we have a good business environment in India. These indicators may not be perfect, but they're highlighting very huge weaknesses in our business environment. And by snapping his fingers, the same officials that were sharp critics of doing business, all of a sudden, one day they wake up and they're great supporters of it, and they're very willing to engage with my team and with the World Bank. So this is important. In fact, I'll give you one more example of something that is happening quite on the margins of the World Bank. The APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, it's a set of 21 countries in the Pacific Rim. A few years ago, they decided that they wanted to improve the business environment and to make it 25% cheaper, easier, and faster to do business in the 21 countries. And, well, what metric are they going to use? Well, lo and behold, they use the doing business indicators. Now, what is really interesting for us is that the 21 countries decided to choose 5 champions, which were the 5 countries that had the highest ranking in doing business. And these champions then would provide technical assistance to the other countries, to basically tell them how they are doing well in various indicators. So I was in Indonesia one day, many years ago, having a chat with a deputy economy minister, and he tells me, "Oh, you can't believe it! The Koreans come every 6 months because they are giving us technical assistance on enforcing contracts." And they can be such hard taskmasters. They're always coming and telling us, you haven't done this, you haven't done that, and you're delayed with this and so on. And then he laughs and he says, however, although they're never happy and never satisfied with what we're doing, we find the relationship very valuable because actually they know how to perform well in this area, and they can provide a great deal of technical input. And so there are these bilateral relationships. The Japanese providing technical assistance to some other countries, and the Canadians to Argentina, and so on and so forth. And this, we didn't have anything to do with it. It was basically just countries taking the data, which is publicly available, and on the basis of that, developing a very interesting reform program involving 21 countries. Yeah. I could give you more examples.
Yes, I think it's very, very interesting. And I should say, among other things, I'm the chairman of the Swedish track and field federation, and it reminds me how sport is organized in different countries. So now I will ask this not only distinguished, but I also promised you a very opinionated panel. So let's start with Member of the Parliament Jenny Nilsson to join us here. She is not only a Member of the Parliament, she's also Chairperson of the Committee of Industry and Trade, very important. Lena Sellgren, Chief Economist of Business Sweden. We have Leif Johansson, does not need a further introduction. And last but definitely not least, Johan Eklund, Managing Director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, that EVA is partnering with for this seminar. So welcome on stage, an applaud. And I also kindly ask our speaker to remain on stage to be part of the panel and at least comment here. First, I would like you to comment a little bit, very shortly on what you have heard, and then we start with the last but not least, Johan Eklund.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me begin by saying I'm delighted that you're back to Sweden, and I don't think we can overestimate the importance of this work. This Doing Business report has had a global impact, and as we've seen from the presentation, has caused tremendous improvements in business conditions globally. But I want to make a few points, and I'll start with one during this 1 minute. And it's a caveat in how to use and how to interpret and how policymakers are using this material. This work goes back to something that influenced me in when I started my PhD in the early 2000s, initiated by Hernando de Soto, and he wrote a book on The Other Path, and he wrote another book on The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. And what he observed was in Peru, and I think this is mentioned in the introduction of this year's report. In Peru, it took 289 days, about 9 months, I think, to start a business. And from the figures Augusto showed us here, we saw a global improvement between 2003 and 2006 from 52 days to 21 days. And now this indicator includes 190 countries. And from this, it looks like Sweden is doing quite well. We're ranked number 9 out of these 190 countries. But now to my caveat. And this is mentioned by Augusto, but I want to really emphasize it, that perhaps we should be careful in interpreting that we're doing very well, because what I think we should be doing, we should be comparing ourselves to the top 30 countries, to the OECD countries. And if we look at the top 30 countries, that ranges from Slovenia in rank number 30, I believe, and New Zealand number 1. And that's the range of countries we should be comparing ourselves with. We shouldn't be comparing the Swedish institutions to Somalia, Eritrea, and Venezuela, which are in the bottom. And when we do so, and here comes the opinion, when we do that, I think we're rather mediocre rather than top performers. So, and that's my first point. I have a few more points to make.
Okay, we then move over to Leif.
Well, I think from the slides that were shown, I think one thing that we need and should understand when we are now in a period of criticism around the European Union is to see that we actually have had if I understood the slide correctly, the highest reform pace in Europe and Central Asia for any comparison from region-wise. And I think that's a very good situation that we can point to say that the European Union has been a political peace project, which is clearly something that we all would like to continue and have continued. But it's actually also been a project of reform. When it comes to ease of doing business, when it comes to entrepreneurial, and with that, by creating a much better continent for us all to live in. And that's remarkably different from where we were post-Second World War up until the early 90s, you could say. So I think we should really give the EU good credit for that.
Okay, we continue.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to thank Professor Lopez and the World Bank actually for developing and improving all the time, because coming from an organization that I do, the Business Sweden, Trade and Invest Council means that we use these kind of indices in different aspects. For example, when we have to prioritize the markets, and the government does it as well, we of course use this measure. It's not directly in the model that we have today, but looking into how fast the markets are growing, GDP, innovation, and so on, we also add, of course, this doing business index, because it's summarized a bit, and we can also compare countries. We also use it out in the whole world, where we actually have offices and colleagues working on the ground. They also use it to be able to compare in the different regions to see how do the different countries relate to each other. Is it easier or more difficult to do businesses? So then it's very good to develop it. And as I see it, this absolute index that you can compare to the frontier, it's a very nice way to do it, because it's not easy to use indices. They do not capture everything. So thank you.
Jenny?
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting to hear what you had to say about the report. And out of my point of view, as a political maker or policy maker, it's very important to be able to confirm that Sweden does well when we compare ourselves to other countries and in an international context. I think that this report shows how important it is to keep continuing to work with the weaknesses that every country has, also Sweden. We measure very well in lots of rankings. I think that we is measuring reasonably well also in this one, but we have also identified in this report some weaknesses that we still have to work with. And we also can see that other countries are improving very much. And we live in a more and more global context, both as a country, but specifically that's very, very real for the companies in Sweden. They are part of a global economics more and more for every day. So we have to make sure that we are on the same page than other successful countries. And I partly agree with what Johan say, that we need to especially look on the countries who is doing better than Sweden are doing, and see what are they doing, and use these kind of materials to find best practice and make sure that we are making okay, at least, when it comes to comparing best practice.
So any comment at this stage?
Thank you for your comments. And I'd just like to pick up on the comment by Mr. Johansson on the European Union. I think it's very appropriate what you say. For me, there is a kind of a personal insight into this, because as a young economist at the IMF, I was actually the economist for Spain. So I used to go to Spain on official missions of the IMF and have engagement with senior officials in the government. And this was at a time when Spain was just joining the European Union in the late 80s. And again, Spain has been in the news in the last couple of years, not always in a favorable light because of the euro crisis and the response to the crisis of 2008 and 2009 and so on. However, if you are struck from that, which is essentially a temporary macro issue, and Spain is already recovering and growing quickly, and you actually look at what has happened to the country in the last 30 years, from that early period to the present, and the transformation has been fantastic. I mean, Spain has a quality of infrastructure that is better than the United States. And I tell you this because I live in the United States. It's a country that I know well. And this would not have happened if it had not been because of the European Union, because the European Union has a formal mechanism whereby the high-income countries actually support the low-income countries through structural funds and other kinds of supports. And but beyond that, the quality of the macro policy, the improvements in the sort of supporting institutions of the market economy has been remarkable. And I don't think Spain, the Spanish, would have been able to do this without the support and the incentives provided by the European Union. And so I come back to this issue. I think beyond the immediate last few years, if we take a long-term perspective, I think the European Union has been remarkably successful in supporting economic growth.
Yeah. Now I have some specific questions for you. I will start with Jenny. In politics, now you're expected to reveal now the insights in politics and your party, the Social Democrat. When you dig into the report, and Professor Lopez did that partially, you see that Sweden is not scoring very well. And if you take the Johan Eklund approach as well, you see that among the OECD countries, we're very low. Like getting credit, we're globally at 75 or something, and that's the lowest where we are. Do you bring that up? Do you follow this index so closely? Because I would assume politically it would be interesting to understand, because it's of course not good to have such an issue in your country.
Well,
do you
not to reveal too much? Just kidding. Yes, of course, we look at important rankings and index, and it is important for the government that Sweden has good results and that we are driving to improve ourselves. And when you mention, I mentioned when I talked, and you mentioned that we have weaknesses, and you pointed out at the greatest weaknesses in this report.
In a total ranking.
In a total ranking, which is the possibility of getting credits, especially for really small and new businesses. And that is a good example of an issue that's a problem for Sweden, but also an issue that we politically have prioritized and worked hard with this whole last year. We have put in place reforms to both increase the possibility of venture capitals for these specific companies who has the greatest problems in this area. And we are now also trying to get in place a better incentives for ordinary banks to improve the ordinary loans for banks. Not all new companies wants venture capital for their businesses. So we have to have both these, both loans and venture capital who is better working. And that has been a priority for the government in all of 2016. And I hope that the work that we have done will show next time we rate.
Yeah, so you could say good news that they're also here in Sweden.
The problem probably is that other countries do it as well. So the thing is, has we done it well enough?
Yes, it's a race to the top instead of race to the bottom. I think that's a better...
And we like races to the top.
Yes, yes. I have a question for Leif. Do you think, or have you experienced, that companies actually use indices like this when they consider investments in the world?
Absolutely. If you look at what globalization has meant for many large global companies, it has actually meant the possibility and sometimes the need to go into different countries and make investments. That can be access to market like in China or South America. It can be how to export. It can be where is the best, what are the best conditions to make an investment. So companies, large global companies, typically use these types of indices as a way to select between where investments can be made. And I think therefore important. But I think let me make one point when we talk about racing to the top, and you made an analogy with sports. In sports, you can say there's usually only one winner and one number two and number three. In this case, I think there's actually very good evidence that we can do a lot of good things in Sweden, we can improve our ranking here without that being detrimental to anyone else. It doesn't mean that anyone else is losing. It just means that we are becoming better. And I think therefore it's not a zero-sum game where some win and some lose. It's actually a situation where we make the whole world or a continent more competitive, more business-oriented, and better to improve. So even within the ranking, you can say, I think it's important to say that this is not a zero-sum game. We would want to have the best efficiency or the best opportunities, for example, in Sweden or the countries where companies like I represent are present.
Thank you. A question for you, Johan. There are lots of interesting observations in this report, and I would imagine this could be a source of future economic research. There are like correlation that more stringent entry-level regulations cause higher level income inequality and higher Gini coefficients, and there are lots of such operations. Do economical researchers around the world pick these observations out to put research into it, and do you use it in as a distinguished researcher in this field?
We certainly do, and many other researchers across the globe do. One example which Pontus and I are working on is on the tax indicator, and we're combining that with the data that we are compiling on entrepreneurship, global entrepreneurship monitor, and looking at how that measures the various phases of an entrepreneur from the startup phase to a mature business, how this tax complexity or tax burden indicator influences the probability of having a growing business. So researchers certainly do it. And then, if I may add another point to this, there is also a wish list among economists around the world, what hopefully would be included. So I would really like to see the labor market indicator come back, and measures of access to human capital, perhaps.
And Lena, a question for you. You mentioned a little bit how this is used when we promote Sweden. A question is, are other countries using it as well? Do you think this will become even more important moving forward? Will we at Arlanda Airport not only find actors, sports stars, and maybe companies saying, we are Swedish, we'll see, we're number 9, we will soon be 5.
Oh, maybe we can wish that. I'm not quite sure we will see it, but you never know, because we are
But how important
moving.
do you think it is when Business Sweden is out there? Because you want to attract both investments and you want us to be attractive, our companies to be attractive out there.
Yes, and I would start to say that there are so many indices out there. For example, this Doing Business is a good one to use, but also for us, we have these other competitiveness indices and innovation. And just looking a little bit, what do we want and what do we want to use all these indices for? It's to get the picture, to understand the competitiveness and international competitiveness. And when it comes to our organization, it's of course the Swedish competitiveness. And then we see not just trade, it's trade and investment. So both promoting our Swedish companies to reach their full potential out in the world, but also attract investments to Sweden. And I think that since other countries, at least some countries out there, also use this, and it's becoming more and more popular to look at the indices, and you have had them for a longer time. Of course, indirectly, this means being high-ranked. Indirectly, it's strengthening our competitiveness. That's how I see it.
Yes, and I would like to add, I think it would strengthen the often very low self-confidence we have in our country.
Yes, and can I add something?
Please.
I think that for all of you here and ourselves to be more proud of Sweden and taking part out there, we need that. We just have 10% of the Swedish companies exporting today.
Any brief comments before I open the floor also?
Just very quickly,
Yes.
I would tend to agree with Johan in terms of his desire to bring back the labor indicator into the ease of doing business. We are trying to do that. It's one of the more politically charged indicators, and therefore there is a technical dimension to this work as well as a political dimension to it. and we're not always, very adept at navigating the difficulties of the second part. My own sense is that if we brought back the labor indicator into doing business, Sweden would not be ranked number 9. I think Sweden would drop quite a number of places. How many, I don't know, but it would drop. Just, I mentioned that in passing.
There are no objections, I see.
This project is contributing in some way to actually change the nature of the World Bank itself as an organization. Perhaps some of my colleagues at the World Bank would not agree with me, but this is, I feel this very strongly. The bank has shifted in some ways over the last few decades from being a financier of development projects into a deliverer of knowledge and information and best practices, right? And you would be surprised, and don't ask me the question, but you would be surprised, how relatively economical for the bank is to finance this operation. I'm not counting the cost, the shadow cost of the 12,000 contributors, which is millions and millions of dollars of time spent, right? But if you take that out, and if you actually ask yourself, how much is the World Bank contributing to this project, out of its budget, it's peanuts compared to other things that the World Bank does. And yet the impact, is huge. And in fact, more and more countries who are not borrowing from the World Bank and haven't borrowed for many, many years because it's very easy to get money in the bond markets, are coming to the World Bank, for this kind of information, which is essentially knowledge. And so my own sense is that in the longer term, the World Bank will be more and more of a knowledge bank and less of a financier of development.
We're gradually running out of time, but we're not out of time yet, luckily. But you want to make a short comment, then Pontus, and then...
Very short question.
Yes.
Short question, actually. Have you? I'm curious about the labor market indicator. Have you considered to broaden it to have a measure of, let's say, time and cost to access human capital? So you're including quality of education, in a sense. I know you've had measures of the time it takes to graduate, etc. Not in the Doing Business report, but in other reports.
We're looking at a number of different options, and skills and so on is one aspect of it. Yeah.
So then we have Pontus, and I will just make this short tech instruction. When you want to comment, you press once, and when there is red light on that rim, then you're allowed to speak. And don't swallow the microphone. You can keep it like 15 centimeters away. Yeah.
Okay.
You see, you're out. No.
There you go. Okay, here's a question to Augusto. Those countries that are in most need of regulatory reform and a better regulatory framework, now they also suffer from a large informal sector very often. So the question is, even if you see that they increase in terms of having a better regulatory environment, for instance, do you also follow whether you see any real effects of that? Do more firms enter into the formal market? Because, even if you can start a firm in a couple of days instead of 30, then you have to pay taxes if you go into the formal market. So, do you keep track of that? One would be new firms entering, the other would be inward foreign direct investment, for instance, and there may be other indicators.
The answer to your question is yes. There is a very large correlation between improvements in the distance to the frontier score on the one hand and reductions in informality on the other. All right. So the data, shows that very, very clearly. Which again, I think is intuitively obvious. Yeah. I will not elaborate. There is very high correlation between distance to the frontier scores on the one hand and FDI per capita inflows on the other. Not only that, but that particular relation is non-linear. In other words, as you improve your distance to the frontier scores, you get an increasing, an accelerating level of foreign direct investment on a per capita basis. Right? So both of them come very, very clearly. In fact, the latter point is so notable that we actually did a short case study on it in one of the previous Doing Business reports 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh, there. please.
Yes,
Please.
I'm from a linear university.
Please use the microphone because there are people on between the chairs.
Okay.
On the other side, because there are people on the actually.
Thank you. I'm Hubert from Linear University. I'm dealing a lot with emerging markets in my profession, and I use one comment and one brief question, please. And I use your indicators very much in order to explain to the students what institutional economics is all about, because the things we're discussing has much to do with institutional economics, and institutions play a major role when it comes to growth and the development of emerging economies. So I think this makes a lot of sense using it when teaching and explaining institutions. But my question mainly is, this is a question I always get from students, if a country like anyone being ranked very much on a low level, 140, 150, India 130, whatever it may be, and these countries know that they have these shortcomings. Why aren't they improving very much their position? Sometimes it may happen, but that they're moving, many of them, very, very slowly or not at all. And then, of course, it may be linked to the political system and things like that. But what is your explanation, why countries being aware about very much of their shortcomings, why doesn't more progress happen in these countries and a little bit faster than it's really the case? Thank you.
Okay.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Look, one of the reasons we developed this absolute metric of progress is precisely to address the point that you're raising, right? Because look, suppose that we had just kept the relative rankings for the next 30 years, right? All the countries could make improvements in the business environment. 30 years from now, we could have a very level playing field, very transparent system of regulatory reform, and we would still have countries that are ranked number 1, number 2, and 189 and 190, right? However, what we look at now is, are these countries that you are thinking that haven't changed their ranking very much in the last few years, are they making improvements in the distance to frontier score? And if they are narrowing the distance with respect to the frontier, that is important, right? That is important. And so what you should tell your students is don't focus on the relative ranking if you're interested in the question of of absolute progress. Focus on the distance to the frontier score. Right? Yeah. That's the simple technical question to your very good question.
Final, last question. Yep. Yes. No. Press once and there should be a red light on there. Yes.
Thank you. Well, I have a question about the credit in Sweden, which takes so long to get. And that's also a methodological problem there. I mean, one observation is that we have 4 dominating banks, and the competition between them is not as good as it should be. Should be more intense. But there is another issue there. If you ask, as Jenny perhaps also has experienced in her life, if you go to a meeting with entrepreneurs and business people, they always complain they don't get the loans they should get. And of course they shouldn't. Not every application should be accepted, because then you would get a lot of bad projects being financed. And so I wonder, and then you take a macro view, that if we would be more careless with giving out credits, our banking system would become more unstable, and there would be problems with the stability of the banking system. So I wonder, I mean, what do you really, is it good always to have a better score on this? Okay. Or how do you, I mean, you're so intelligent and so on, and how do you actually formulate a good measure of the banking system's ability to serve the business community? Okay. Is this a good measure which you have?
You have highlighted something that for us is sometimes a bit of an awkward situation. When people look at the name of the indicator, getting credit, immediately what they assume is that it is an indicator that captures the ease of credit conditions in the economy at large, right? That ultimately says something about monetary policy and, you know, whether credit is tight or it's more easily available and so on. That is misleading. The getting credit indicator actually captures other things other than you know, the ease of credit conditions. What we're looking at is more institutional aspects that have to do, for instance, with you know, creditor rights within the system. You know, that have to do with the existence of credit reporting systems and the information that they deliver to agencies that then can calculate scores on the reliability of borrowers and so on. It is these institutional aspects of the credit system that are embedded in the indicator, not the ease of credit conditions from a monetary policy perspective.
So with that, we actually need to finish on time, and I'd like to thank, of course, our speaker, Professor Augusto Lopez Claros. We have some small tokens from the Academy to also the external panelists. So I'd like to give both Professor
Thank you very much.
Claros Lopez Claros and this distinguished and opinionated panel that I think delivered to full satisfaction. Thank you very much. So with that, I wish you a good day, and don't do anything bad out there. Thank you.